Hi, everyone. I welcome you all to this event, which aims to highlight the important role of women's global agency in diplomacy and feminist movements that have come together very closely with peace movements. Conflict transformation, as we have seen over the past decades, has been taking a women-centric approach, demanding our systems and governments to change the way conflicts are being addressed, and recognize the very need of engaging with and tapping on women's agency, expertise, and their initiatives as a resource for making a positive difference, including the important roles and initiatives by women in the diaspora and women in exile, who are key actors in shaping the political environment around conflict resolution and addressing issues of justice, rights, and freedom, something that needs further understanding on how these movements are being utilized by the various actors. There is need for an in-depth analysis of the historic and contemporary accounts of women's agency and movements and the direction that it's taking, and to see how much our political systems are supportive of this global agenda, and to understand the changing discourse around the new forms of diplomacy and representation. We will not have answers to all of these questions today, but we'll open up a dialogue that can be pursued. We have seen the fall of Afghanistan last year, and we are witnessing the derail of all sorts of human development in the country, particularly women's achievements and rights. We're also witnessing the uprising in Iran, demanding attention to some of the fundamental rights issues. And we are witnessing the agency and diplomacy of women around the globe and their leadership in mobilizing communities, demanding attention and action, and most of all, demanding inclusion in the actual decision-making. Saying this, I thank and welcome all of our speakers today, and note that all of them have been engaging in and on Afghanistan directly and indirectly. They also bring experiences of their work in various other contexts and regions. As part of the discussion, I'll encourage our speakers and participants from the floor to share about specific or general support mechanisms that they have engaged in or that they recommend as a way forward to support this agenda. Our keynote speaker today is Sanam Andrelini. Most of you know Sanam already. Sanam is a globally recognized advocate in the field of women, peace, and security, with 24 years of experience as a peace strategist working on conflicts, crisis, and violent extremism with a mix of civil society, governments, and the UN. Sanam is the founder and CEO of the International Civil Society Action Network, where she spearheads the Women's Alliance for Security Leadership, comprising independent women-led organizations active in 40 countries, preventing violence and promoting peace, rights, and pluralism. Sanam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rahmana. Thank you, everyone. I hope you can hear me. It's really a pleasure to be here with everybody and to have this conversation, because it's actually a really difficult conversation to be having, both in the context of looking back at the last year and a half or so of what's been going on in Afghanistan, and of course looking at it from the context of what's going on in Iran right now. And I just wanted to sort of, before I get into the analysis, just give you sort of a slightly personal context of how I see these issues and how I've been involved in this field. I was 11 when the Iranian Revolution sort of took place and ended up leaving and essentially becoming refugees with, my mother had to seek asylum in England. Throughout my childhood or growing up, and then later in my work, the question of what happens to women when you have crises like revolutions, like conflict and so forth, was really prominent, because what we saw was that as men were being targeted and losing their jobs, being harassed, being threatened to be thrown in jail and so forth, it really was women having to take that step into the public space and having to deal with not only the issues around family and so forth, but also dealing with the state. When the men are in hiding, or literally they've had to flee the country, or they're thrown in jail and you don't know who was executed last night, and you're looking for people. It's the women who end up taking on these roles and having to deal with new forces and new authorities. So that was always a prominent aspect of kind of this, what I grew up, even though we were abroad, hearing the stories. The second thing is that in the 1990s, we saw the shift in terms of the international space of the wars that we were dealing with were civil wars or internal wars. They had obviously proxy elements and transnational elements, but it was kind of within the boundaries of Sierra Leone or Liberia or other countries. And the international mechanism that we have, the internet, the UN, the entire international architecture is really not designed to deal with those kinds of wars, because it's about the primacy of state sovereignty and non-interference. And that issue has remained a big challenge for any of the countries we're dealing with. Things have evolved, and the Women, Peace and Security agenda has really been one of the gateways to try and evolve the system to allow for the international system architecture and international actors to engage with local peace actors. But the major shift that we've seen has been that we are now really easily welcoming non-state armed actors like the Taliban to peace talks and giving them resources and so forth. But when it comes to non-state unarmed actors, civil society actors that are engaged in the issues of conflict, whether it's around mitigation, whether it's mediation, whether it's dealing with humanitarian or security issues on the ground, non-state civil society actors and unarmed actors are still struggling to get in, and particularly women. Even though we've had the WPS agenda for 22 years, it's still the question comes up, well, who are these women? Why them? Why are they credible? Whereas if you say, oh, religious leaders need to be present, everyone says, yes, of course, religious leaders should be present. Business leaders even, let them come. Nobody says, who are these people? But when it comes to women, it's still consistently, who are they? Why them? We represent them. Oh, it's our culture. They shouldn't, that they're absent and so forth. So there's a duality around not only the systems not welcoming and being open, but also there's inherent sexism and racism. I think that is still integral to the questions. Now, in the case of Afghanistan, there's kind of the big picture and some of the work that ICANN has done. ICANN, as an organization, we spearhead a network. We had and we still have a number of Afghan organizations, locally rooted, women-led peace organizations that have been part of our network. And on the one hand, our approach is to support and sustain local movements and help build up local structures and institutions of women's activism for peace. And at the same time, we do a lot of advocacy and work on the international space around the issue of inclusive and gender responsive peace processes. So we have resources that we've developed. We have trainings that we provide. We have mechanisms and things of saying, this is how you can do it. So it's not to say we don't know the issue is not that we don't know how to do it. We have many different models of how you can do inclusion and how you can do gender responsiveness. It's really, again, butting up against our diplomatic systems and structures that consistently push back on the question of women or do it in a very tokenistic way. And I'm happy to explain that in more depth later on. But in the case of Afghanistan, if we look back at WPS as an agenda and the situation in Afghanistan, from the time that I was involved back in the 1990s on the question of women, and then a global conference where we came together with women from war zones, including Afghans and others, and everybody said we need a common framework to talk about women's experiences of war, women's roles as peacemakers, women's victimization and what happens to them and protection needs, and of course women's rights, women's physical protection and legal rights in terms of constitutions and so forth. Those kinds of issues were coming up in the late 90s. They are embedded in the 1325 agenda because we drafted the first version of it through civil society globally together. And then, of course, it's expanded through time. At the heart of that, Afghanistan was a really important country in terms of shaping the discourse, as was Northern Ireland and other places. But Afghanistan was important because we saw in the 1990s that the Taliban had come in. We saw in the 1990s that the Taliban had a specific targeting of women. So very much in parallel, if you want, with Iran, where the Islamists came in And one of the first things they did was to suspend women's rights in many spheres of life. The Taliban came into Afghanistan and they were much harsher. You know, the questions of education and pushing women back and the burqa and so forth. So it was very much part of of shaping the idea of why we needed a women, peace, and security agenda. The case of Afghanistan. Then you come, we get the agenda, we get the resolution, and within a year you have 9/11, and right on the back of 9/11 comes the push in the United States to say, well, we have to go to Afghanistan, we have to go get Osama bin Laden, but the way they sold the Afghan war and occupation in the US was with Laura Bush coming on television and saying, we must go and, fight for Afghan women's rights, right? So right from the outset, the war and, the claim to support women was instrumentalized and became one of the stories of the US presence and then, NATO and others' presence in Afghanistan. In all the years that I've been back and forth in these spaces, whether it's with my Afghan colleagues or with Americans and others, I found it incredibly frustrating because I'd come across very senior advisors to the State Department on the Afghan file who would say, 5, 10, 15 years down from 2001 onwards, who would say, we're not interested, or the issue of Afghan women is not our problem, right? So they used it as an excuse to sell the war and go in, but once they were there, it became very murky and it was very unclear, especially in the peace and security space, especially in anything to do with negotiations and so forth. So what we saw, and I'm trying, Nargis and others can speak to this more, but what we saw was that there was a big push. There were some very important developments around rights, ensuring rights in the Constitution, establishing quotas for women in parliament, fostering women in the media, in the legal profession, judges, lawyers, civil society. We see all this. So there's 20 years of some really interesting activism and across different professions that there's a push, but there were also major gaps, and sitting outside observing it, especially when it came to the question of, as I say, the negotiations and the peace and security dimensions, we were witnessing certain challenges. So, for example, from the outset, the advocacy from the WPS community and people like me and others was Afghan women must be at the peace tables, whatever negotiations are happening, whether it's with the Western allies or with NATO or wherever they are, and especially starting in 2008, 2009, when it was clear that things were going to move forward with the Taliban. Our advocacy was, you have to have a delegation of Afghan women peace builders at the table representing themselves and the voices of the communities that they work with. It's not enough to just try and shove women into the government delegation, which is what happened, right? So we were saying it's really important to have Afghan women present as an independent sector, as an independent set of voices, bring at a negotiating team of their own. What the international community did was to constantly push women into sideshows and sideline them into, oh, we're going to have a side event with Afghan women. We're going to have a separate event in wherever it was, Oslo, Turkey, wherever you want to name. And yes, we'll bring 100 Afghan women together to come up with, the latest statements and so forth. That sidelining and sideshowing is a huge problem. And it's something that they consider that keeps being repeated in other countries. It was done with Syria as well. It was done with Yemen. And if there's any lesson to be learned moving forward for any other context, I would say, if you see this being the direction that they're sending you, stop and say, we're not going to participate, because that's really a window dressing. It's just trying to sort of give women a little space, but it's really not tied to the more significant spaces where negotiations are happening. So that's one thing. The second thing is that around organizing and helping women plan and strategize around kind of these international engagements, We did a study back in 2008, 2009, published in 2010, to see what had been done 10 years into the WPS agenda around women's participation in peace processes, so in these formal structures and systems. And one of the things that we found from across a number of countries was that there was a lot of training and so quote unquote capacity building done for women, but it tended to be around women's rights. So, and in Afghanistan, this was really prevalent, that, endless organizations had gone in and trained women on women's rights. I think Afghan women probably know their rights far better than anybody, frankly. But it was this idea that, oh yes, we must go train women on, give whatever the rights question is, advocacy skills, leadership skills. But when it came to saying, well, what's been the training and the strategic thinking around having a cohort of women who can be really effective on security issues, on what it means to negotiate ceasefires, on what it means to negotiate federalism and these technical issues that always come up in the context of peace processes. Nobody was doing it because it's hard, right? These are relatively new things, and to layer it with a gendered lens specifically was it's not the work of your standard women's rights organizations or others that go into these spaces. It's specialized work. At ICANN, we started doing, once we saw this gap, so we started developing these tools and resources. And it's really important because if you spend 90% of your time saying women must be at the table, and then last minute, and this is what happens all the time, last minute, they say, okay, here are 3 women that can go. If they're not equipped and if they don't feel confident to know how to step into the space and talk about security arrangements, then they feel discredited, and they become again window dressing, right? It's like, oh yes, the women were there, but what did they put into the talks? How did they shape it? So it's really important to understand the processes, peace processes, whether we like them or not, when they happen, there are technical, very serious issues that happen. It's really important to have women prepared and trained and ready to go in at bringing not only their knowledge of the technical stuff, but that gendered approach to it, so that at the end of the day, if you're talking about ceasefires, you can say, we want to make sure that a ceasefire isn't just stopping the guns, it's also stopping sexual violence. It's, if we're having ceasefire lines, it's not just for the soldiers and militias to walk across and be safe. It has to be safe for women who are going across. It's got to be safe for young men who are going across, and so forth. If we want to do monitoring, work with women in communities to be part of the monitoring and verification of ceasefire agreements. I can give you endless examples of these kinds of things, but they're technical issues. None of this was really done effectively, I think, for our Afghan colleagues. Then you get to a situation where, okay, so now these talks are happening. Afghan women were warning the world about the Taliban from the outset, and they were saying, don't believe it, and look at what's happening on the ground. Again, it's extraordinary to think, when we look back, to see there were negotiations happening in Doha at the same time that women's clinics, universities, schools, etc., were being bombed. And at that point, when you see that, you have to ask yourself, well, what's going on, and what really is the end game here? And to me, the issue that happened is that, for whatever reason, Zalmay Khalilzad, who was the US envoy for Afghanistan, essentially sold out the women's rights issues and the life of women, if you want, at the peace table, because there was no moment where they stopped and said, oh, this bombing is happening. Let's, we're not going to give you your 5,000 Talib fighters out of jail, right? So there was never a real interest in the civilian component and the issues around women or other marginalized communities at the negotiation table. And when it was the US Taliban discussions, and then when they brought the so-called government delegation, it was again really complicated, because you have 50% of the room is Taliban, 50% of the room is meant to be the rest of Afghan society. It was meant to be the current government, it was meant to be the government, the opposition, for women, different sort of other groups and forces, political forces in the country. That's totally unrealistic. It is totally unrepresentative of the reality that's on the ground. And yet this is what they did, not only for Afghanistan, they've done it for Syria, they've done it for Yemen and so forth. This constant kind of framing things as a two-party football game. we've had other places where this wasn't done, and Northern Ireland was one of them. They had 10 parties at the table, right? So we know how to do inclusion. We've got lots of examples of that. We know how to have women's voices, and gendered approaches. It's been done. In the case of Afghanistan, these aspects were willfully excluded and stonewalled and sidelined. The net result is that the Taliban not only took over, we've seen what they represent, and we've seen what they've done to the lives of women. Then we come, I'm just sort of fast forwarding to August of 2021. Back in the 2020, we, again, from the ICANN side, working with our partners around the world and with the Foreign Office and so forth, we talked a lot about the issue of the threats against peace builders, not just against women's rights activists, but against women who take on peace building work, because there's a very fragile space in the middle where you're trying to say we need to talk to each other, and in very polarized universes. And it can be very threatening. We produced a document, we produced a framework. The current UK Foreign Minister, James Cleverly, went to the Security Council and said, we stand by the need to protect women peace builders. We take a pledge, and we encourage other countries to come forward and support this. That was in October of 2020. August of 2021, when it came to the evacuation, Afghan women, lawyers, judges, journalists, police officers, army officers, politicians, civil society, community workers, all the women who had been in the front lines, who were building their country, were actually left behind and excluded. We've consistently asked for gender disaggregated data about who was evacuated, and of the women who were evacuated, what percentage of them were principals, meaning they were evacuated not because they were the wife of someone or the daughter of someone, but because of their own work. And nobody would give us the percentages because they didn't really think about it like that. So the idea that, oh, we're going to protect, and part of the protection agenda was if the time comes, people need to be evacuated safely or allowed safe passage out. For the women who risked their lives, this wasn't done. So in the last year and a half, ICANN, with our other partners, have been one of the few organizations that is trying to help figure out how you still get people out. And it's devastating. We get calls all the time for people whose lives are at risk. Why? Because they leaned forward. They believed in NATO and the US and the world and the WPS agenda about, oh, you should be a police officer. You can serve your community. So we have failed Afghan women on a scale that is unfathomable. And the cost of it right now in Afghanistan, and how we try and shore up what was there and move forward for next generations, is profound. But also it really reflects badly on the global agenda and the global actors, and it's really discredited. Any country that says we stand for women, peace, and security, if you look at their role vis-a-vis Afghanistan, it's a failure. The UK evacuated cats and dogs, 200 cats and dogs. So, but not Afghan women, and this battle is still going on. So we are in a very precarious space, I think, in terms of the legitimacy of the international institutions around this agenda. But at the same time, and I'll end here, we're also at another inflection point, which is that this agenda has never been more important, given what we see around the world. We have climate change issues, we have conflicts that are going on, we have migration and displacement, all these issues that together sort of funnel people into spaces of violence and insecurity and crisis is expanding. And what we see on the ground is that it's women peace builders who are running to the problem and trying to mitigate and deal with them, whether it was COVID, whether it's floods in Pakistan, whether it's drought in Iraq. It's the women who are doing the peace work who are now kind of pivoting and addressing these needs on the ground. So they're there, they're responding at a local level, they're risking their lives, and yet at an international level, we are channeling still a tiny pittance of the resources that's needed. We're not able to guarantee the protection needs. And worse still, we're not even thinking about these issues from a gendered lens and gender responsiveness and bringing them to the table to say, what would be practical solutions going forward? So the need is there, the relevance is significant, And yet the shifts, I think, are not enough. And the discourse of feminist foreign policy, which is coming and should be something that is really binding these together, is a good moment, but it really needs to be taken seriously, and it needs to become part of the DNA of our institutions. Otherwise, what I worry about is that that's going to be another fad, and we're going to revert back to sort of very old-fashioned systems of trying to do diplomacy and security and forget about the human beings on the ground who are doing this work. Sorry to be kind of sobering, but this is what I wanted to share, and happy to talk a little bit more about Iran or other places going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sanam. You have highlighted some really important issues of inclusion and thematics linked to that inclusion, and the historic context on how much the Afghan context shaped the WPS agenda over the past 25 years, or since this agenda came under the discussion. And I believe at the time, Afghan women in exile have played an important role in shaping this agenda. But we are still struggling with including them in the decision-making, but also in addressing the basic needs of those women. So Sanam, while you're here, we'll benefit from your experience during the discussion round. At the moment, now I'll go to our next speaker, who is Laila Alodat. Laila is a qualified lawyer and trainer of international humanitarian law. Her areas of focus include peace building and women's human rights. She currently serves as the Deputy Secretary General at the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and sits on the governance and advisory boards of several regional and international human rights organizations, trusts, and foundations. So Laila, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. But I just wanted to remind you in the interest of time that the time for each speaker is maximum 8 minutes, so that we have a discussion round as well later.
I'll keep it short. Thank you so much. And thanks for inviting me to speak today. It's such a pleasure to speak alongside wonderful feminists and to listen to their insightful contributions. I thought that today I want to use the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, where I work, as an example to examine the history and development of women's agency and role in diplomacy. As many of you know, WILF started in 1915 when 1,100 women from 12 countries, including nations on both sides of the conflict at the time, sat down together in The Hague to discuss how to stop the carnage of the First World War. At the time, they didn't argue about the relative responsibility of the parties to the conflict. They actually believed that everyone, no matter where they lived, must shoulder some of the blame. Their aim was rather to find a mechanism of mediation that could end the conflict there and then. And on the long term, they were determined to identify and eradicate the causes of war. The 1915 conference ended with the formation of the International Women's Committee for Permanent Peace, which dispatched women envoys to heads of states in 14 countries, urging a peace commission of neutral states. And while those women did not achieve their primary goal of an immediate ceasefire and of preventing the First World War, a building block of women organizing for peace was created. And they met again 4 years later in Zurich and provided a critical analysis of the Versailles Treaty. At the time, they fiercely protested the punitive terms to the victors, and they warned that an unjust peace was likely to cause a renewal of war. Unfortunately, they were right. 20 years after that, another world war would result in the loss of around 80 million people. These women formed the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, and the League sought to demilitarize the word, all countries, not just those that were defeated in war. And 100 years later, we still believe that the achievement of peace is inseparable from the achievement of equality and justice for all, as well as the full inclusion and representation of women in all our diversity. And I want to invite you to join WILF in how we commit to eradicating war and what root causes we want to address and how are they related to what Sanam has just mentioned, all the mistakes that have been done and that we continue to do in raging conflicts around the world. WILF is committed to eradicating war by addressing the root causes, and we believe the root causes are militarization, the militarization of states and groups and individuals, as well as capitalism and exploitation. The nation-state system that produces occupation, neocolonialism, failing democracies, political repression, and racism. We also believe that a deep root cause of conflict is social systems of racist supremacy and of cultural domination, and obviously of patriarchy and how it shapes our world. I want you to think of what does this movement tell us about women diplomacy and about women's agency? The movement that started with limited number of women with privilege. I mean, think who had a passport in 1915, who could travel from one country to another. At the time, there were women with privilege. The movement has now expanded around the world. Our last Congress this July, we accepted 10 new sections. We now have 40 sections around the world. And we have, the movement has seen vast expansion in Africa, and we continue to work to bring together our historic standing and legacy in identifying and stopping the root causes of war with new visions and contextual expertise to continue our fight for feminist peace. We believe that applying our values and goals within different contexts should be complementary and should be linked through movement building, through organizing, through creating spaces to convene and exchange and strategize. As you know too well, and as Sana mentioned so wonderfully, conflicts do not happen in a vacuum. Raging wars in the global south are fueled by arms produced in the global north. It is the profiteering from war and violence that we should call out and stop, as you are doing in this very session. There's a wealth of examples of fruitful agency and diplomacy by women in conflict countries. Feminists have been organizing and mobilizing to reimagine what peace processes should look like. And that meant that they led to the efforts to widen the scope of the Women, Peace and Security agenda from one centered around state security to one centered around human security. And feminist peace activists continue to work to shift the mainstream narrative around diplomacy and participation in peace processes, so that it's not only happening behind closed door or at high-level meetings or with selected group of stakeholders, but rather providing successful cases of building sustainable peace at community and national and regional levels. And also linking this peace building to issues that are most consequential to communities. And we have fantastic examples. WASL has a lot of examples in WILF partners, and we witness examples of negotiating localized ceasefires, of negotiating with armed groups how to send children to schools, about enforcing humanitarian corridors, and the examples are plenty. And just like feminist activists are expanding the notion of peace building, I want to invite you to expand the notion of diplomacy and agency beyond the work within conflict countries. It is equally important for women whose countries are not necessarily in conflict to work hard within the spaces accessible to them to achieve non-corrupt electoral democracies, assure human rights for all, call out the profiteering from war and violence by states and by corporations, and challenge racism and white supremacy and their manifestations, all the way from daily microaggressions to border states and how they are manifesting, you know, where we see children wash off shores as their families try to flee safety. We all have a role to identify and challenge power structures, and to capitalize on the power of cooperation, of collective organizing at all levels. And we will have to invent and strengthen practices of social healing, of citizen assemblies, of democratic action within and across nations to eradicate the social, cultural, and political causes of war. Thank you for accepting this invitation. Let's think together to link the work for peace, both in countries fighting conflict and countries that are linked to it in so many ways. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Leila. This was, I mean, you brought some really important points to the floor. Countries in non-conflict contexts to work towards inclusive peace. And it is indeed important that we have all our allies on our side who may be in conflict contexts or non-conflict contexts. I'll go to the next speaker. So sorry, I forgot in the beginning to mention that Sharia Marhaban, one of our speakers, has sent her apologies for not being able to join today due to her last minute travel change in her schedule. Our next speaker is Nargis Nihan. Nargis has held numerous positions, senior positions in the public offices in Afghanistan. She is also the founder of Equality for Peace and Democracy, a civil society organization for empowering women and youth across 16 provinces in Afghanistan. Nargis also served as a member of the Supreme Council of Afghanistan Central Bank. She's a strong advocate for women's rights in Afghanistan, currently actioning her work in exile. Nargis, we are keen to hear from you about some practical examples and challenges of where the international collaboration, agency, and solidarity among women and other stakeholders have worked in the case of Afghanistan. And where do you see the gaps, and what else can be done in order to strengthen this agency and collaboration in the favor of Afghanistan and Afghan women in particular? Nargis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kahramona John. And can you hear me very well? Because my connection is not stable. Good.
Yes, we do.
First of all, I have to thank you, Kahramona John, and I have to thank the organizers for arranging this very engaging and important discussion. To add up on what Sanam John and other speakers have already said, I would like to divide my perspective in 2 or 3 parts, actually. It's important that I provide brief information on the situation of women and the whole around international diplomacy and Global Women's Agency before 15th August or before a collapse of the state in Afghanistan. And then right after that, what we see is happening and what is actually our conclusion when we compare the situation, especially the statements with the reality on the ground. As you all know very well, and as it was mentioned by Sanam John, that the world decided to engage, and it was led by the US, to engage with Afghanistan, fight terrorism. But of course, as a side support, they also decided that, okay, we have to support Afghan women. And that support was coming both politically and as well as financially. So as it was mentioned, it really provided the opportunity. And we really have to look at the woman, Afghan woman resilience, capacity, leadership, and agency by how they turn every small opportunity in the last 20 years into a big opportunity and trying to use that as a means to be able to strengthen their position and be able to serve their community in Afghan society. So we saw the women suddenly going from 0 participation to more than 50 participation in the education sector and the health sector, not only in these social sectors, but also in the very male-dominated sectors such as communication, finance, security. We had women participation in all these sectors in Afghanistan. We had Afghan Women Chamber of Commerce working and advocating for women entrepreneurs. We had more than thousands of women civil society organizations working in global and regionally and as well as at the community level, promoting women's rights in Afghanistan. So women were actually advancing each and every area. And there were so many success stories that we had to share and we were sharing with the world. But of course, the focus was so much on the fight that nobody was paying attention on beside all those challenges that we had in Afghanistan, that how much advancement we were making. We have to remember when we are talking about all these advancement that Afghanistan was still in conflict, the war was still going on, and Afghanistan was still a very male-dominated society, and the communities were very much masculine when it was coming to accepting women as leaders in their community. But women were making progress each and every hour in Afghanistan. Now coming to the peace process, as soon as the US decided that they would like to start the peace process according to themselves and would like to have a political settlement with the Taliban and bring Taliban to the table and have a power sharing agreement so that they can end the violence in Afghanistan, right from the first day. You can go and you can Google and see all the position papers that we have developed and we have issued from Afghan women's side. And we kept on reminding them that we have to remember there has to be accountability mechanism. There has to be monitoring mechanism in place. And we have to make sure that we have the mechanism in place for holding Taliban to account. And then we also have to make sure that the process is totally inclusive. So that is something.
Sorry, Nargis, you're muted. We lost you for a bit.
Yeah, I will turn off my camera just to make sure that I have a good connection. So the peace process went ahead despite all the reminders and all the warnings that we kept on giving to the international community and especially to the US. What I saw as a women's rights activist, that sometimes I was working in the civil society and I was also serving in the public sector, that when there were missions coming to Afghanistan, they were always making sure that they were meeting the Afghan women in different groups. They were taking pictures with them. They were writing about it. But then when it was coming to actual discussions and decision making about the peace process, it was actually the discussion happening between the men behind the closed doors, without our engagement, without our involvement, and actually without our knowledge. So what we saw that the peace deal actually signed, and as a result of that, after a few months, the whole state collapsed. And today, Afghan women are paying the highest price for that. The group that actually kept on advocating for a very responsible peace process. We saw the withdrawal of the international community from Afghanistan once again, despite all our reminders that if you withdraw irresponsibly from Afghanistan, everything is going to fall apart. And it's not only about Afghan people, it's also about having the Afghanistan turning once again into safe havens for the terrorist group, but unfortunately they did not hear us. What they kept on telling us, I remember very well that when we were going in different platforms and we were talking about Afghan women's leadership, Afghan women's capacity, about our voice and our perspective, they were very nicely telling us that, oh, it's a small group of you living in urban in Kabul, but we don't hear the same perspective from women when we are going to rule of Afghanistan. I mean, even in very advanced countries like US, can you compare the knowledge and perspective of a woman living in DC with someone who's living in rural and is doing an ordinary job? Of course, the capacities are different, the leaderships are different. So they kept on trying to delegitimize our leadership, and they try to weaken our voice by kept on saying that, oh, you represent a small group of Afghan women who are elite women inside Kabul. You don't represent whole of Afghanistan and rural Afghanistan. And when we go to the rural Afghanistan, all women are asking for us is peace. We said, yes, we are also asking for peace and security, but we're also asking for sustainable peace and security, which should not be only the end of violence, but should also be the participation of development. So we saw the collapse of everything after 15 August. And once again, the international community was so ready to engage with the Taliban and was so ready to actually move ahead with the Taliban. But actually, they were shocked when they saw that Taliban, as soon as they came to power, they began to show their real face. And all those promises that they made during the peace process, that they have changed, they have become moderate, they have changed their perspective about women's rights, they have changed their perspective about inclusivity of Afghanistan, they began to show that they have not changed. If they have changed, unfortunately, it's for worse, it's not for good. And then they thought that, okay, the group of elite women that we evacuated, they're all outside Afghanistan. They do not represent Afghanistan anymore. What became as a silver lining for all of us was the different groups of women in different parts of Afghanistan, especially the young generation, that they began to start demonstrations and protests, going on the street and asking for their rights. That was something that nobody was expecting, and nobody was thought that they are going to come out on the streets, they are going to take all the risks, and they're going to ask for their rights. So that is very important that we have to take into account on what is happening on the ground. But of course, there are also the role of technology that we have to acknowledge. If it was during 90s, I don't think we would have had same coverage that we had of this time about women's protest, everything, because the technology allowed us. While the Taliban, the mainstream media, most of them decided not to cover what women were doing, while the Taliban tried to suppress them, but social media, especially Twitter and Facebook, allowed women to keep on going out for the protest and like making the videos themselves and posting them. So, and then we also, most of us who were in exile and the women that we already had in diaspora, it also provided us with the opportunity to get all those information and began to amplify their voices and different platforms with the international community. So I think like these things are important that we have to take into account when we are talking about women's agency, that when we are talking about women's agency, we have to look on at what is happening on the ground. The international community at the political level, they still won't engage with the Taliban. They still are hoping that they can change Taliban. They can convince Taliban to open the schools. They can convince Taliban for formation of inclusive government, and they can convince Taliban for granting women, Afghan women, all their rights. Although 15 months have passed and we don't see any improvement in the Taliban's action policy, as I said, if we see any change, it's actually for worse. So in terms of international communities engagement, it has not been as supportive to the Afghan women, unfortunately, as it should have been. While we see that the girls are going protesting on the street, still we do not see same coverage and platform that Afghan women deserve to have it. What we also see that, yes, in terms of international diplomacy, while having all this advocacy, we have managed to raise awareness. We have managed to create pressure on the international community so that they don't engage openly with the Taliban. They don't easily recognize Taliban. But then in the meantime, still we don't see ourselves in the decision-making process. So this is something that we have to take into account. When I look at the situation right now, there are a couple of points as a conclusion that I would like to share with you, especially all of them from a perspective of Afghanistan situation as someone that I've engaged there for 20 years. I think reflection is very much important for all of us, that we have to see that despite all the conferences that we are conducting regionally, nationally, locally, internationally, there's so much happening about women's rights. We need to have a reflection that still why the situation of women in countries like Afghanistan, Yemen, and Iran are not changing. Why we cannot change this political discourse for these countries, especially when it comes to women, peace and security. Yes, we understand like what is happening at the political side of it, but we also have to have a reflection that what is happening on the women's side and like what is it that we can do to strengthen our efforts. And healing is very much important. I think the more we have dialogue amongst ourselves, the more we have these kind of discussions amongst ourselves, it actually helps us to understand each other, to discuss more challenges and try to find solution for them. And it's very much important, and it's not only that in the women of third countries like Afghanistan, the national community, especially the politicians, to use us as a weapon for their political purposes. That's exactly what they did to Afghan women. Whenever they wanted to engage in Afghanistan, they come and use Afghan women as excuse. When they withdraw, they totally forgot about Afghan women. And even that Afghan women's situation are worse of the worst right now. It's because it's not in their political agenda. They're not paying any attention. So I think this is something really important that we should continuously remind them that they cannot weaponize women's rights anymore. They should not weaponize human rights anymore. And we should not allow them to do that. In terms of inclusivity of the process, it's very much important that we make sure that when we are talking about women's rights, women's agency, especially in countries like Afghanistan, it's important that we provide platform for Afghan women that they talk for themselves rather than trying to talk for Afghan women. That's what we see happening after 15th August, because most of us are in exile and those of us in Afghanistan are having different restrictions. We see most of our international partners that they go and they talk for Afghan women. Please don't talk for us. Help with us that we talk for ourselves and provide us with the platform. We also need to have a reflection on the role of agencies, international agencies such as UN. What do we do about them? For example, in case of Afghanistan, I just got out of another meeting where we had women rights activists participating from Kabul, and their overall general impression is that UN is working more for Taliban than the Afghan people. So we really need to have more of a dialogue and discussion with the UN agencies and telling them that, what is it that you're doing? you also need to make sure that if you're serving the people in whichever country that you're working and staying. And in conclusion, we also have to look at the whole notion of extremism that's happening not only in Afghanistan and Iran, but in all countries. End of the day, there are two ideologies that are right now in conflict with each other, and we are fighting. We have one ideology, which is an open society with equal rights, with full participation of women, with women agency that can take the countries and nations forward. But then you're also having the other ideology that wants to suppress the nation, wants to suppress the woman, and want to control them with different means and excuses that can they can use, whether it's religion, whether it's policy, or whatever we call about them. If we are all working for an open society, then we are allies, and we should remain allies, and we should work like allies. So we expect the international community and we expect the world that they do not change their position in like one way or the other way. And they should stop in thinking that they can change a terrorist group like Taliban and convince them to form a government and work with Afghan women and try to improve the situation. In case of Afghanistan, the time has come after 15 months that we have a proper reflection of the situation. And in light of that, we should ask ourselves the hard question that, okay, if the Taliban are ruling Afghanistan the way that they're right now, what is the result of that? The result of that is going to be a generation of Taliban's idea after 10 years. How are we going to deal with that society? If we want to prevent that situation, we should think about different ways that how we can change the situation in Afghanistan. And the only group and the only force right now that is protesting against the Taliban is the women group of Afghanistan, inside Afghanistan and as well as outside Afghanistan. So why we cannot work together to strengthen Afghan women inside Afghanistan and outside Afghanistan, provide them with a platform that they speak for themselves. They come up with a peace process. They come with a peace roadmap. We push, at least if the Taliban are not open to Afghan women, at least we can begin to have dialogue of Afghan women with other political groups and other political factions, so that we can begin to build more alliances amongst ourselves and have a stronger front against the Taliban. It's not that we're not doing any of these efforts. We are doing a lot. But at the end of the day, we have to remember, and this is going to be my concluding point, that Afghanistan conflict is not only a simple internal conflict of Afghanistan. It has its internal dimension, regional dimension, and it has its international dimension. That's why for us, in order to move ahead, to be able to have a political settlement with proper participation of women and a peace process, it's important that we get the support of countries in the region and as well as internationally. Thank you very much, John, for your patience and for question and answer. I'm here.
Thank you so much, Nargis John. You spoke about the agency of women outside and inside Afghanistan, and we have seen the role that they have played in advocating for the country, and which has actually influenced decisions with relations to diplomatic dealings and relations of the world with the Taliban. Before I go to our next speaker, I would like to ask our participants and audience today to share any reflections or thoughts or questions in the chat box, and we will include those in our discussion round. I'll now go to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Loredana. Sorry, Loredana, your last name is always difficult for me to pronounce.
Teodorescu.
Teodorescu, okay. Loredana is the president of the Italian chapter of Women in International Security, a global organization dedicated to advancing the leadership and professional development of women in the field of international relations, peace, and security. Loredana coordinates the Mediterranean Women Mediators Network and is also currently managing the Secretariat of the Global Alliance of Regional Women Mediator Networks. Her areas of interest and focus are women's leadership and participation in foreign policy, peace and security, and the EU. And on EU, more specifically, foreign policy, migration, and asylum, and the link between internal security and external relations. Loredana, the floor is yours. And I mean, please, in addition to what you have to say, I would kindly ask you to maybe share your thoughts on the values that the Global Alliance or the regional women mediators networks and its members can add to the existing mechanisms of support. And if you see any opportunities for mediating conflicts of understanding the nature of the problem, if our political systems support women's collective initiatives for a positive change.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Karamama, and thank you for providing such a platform for discussion. I think it's really important to keep the attention on women, peace and security agenda and on Afghanistan. As we are living challenging times, we know that we are experiencing unprecedented pressure on peace and on women. So we are experiencing serious pushback that can derail the progress made so far. But at the same time, conflicts, displacement, serious challenges are continuing to increase. After 22 years since the adoption of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, we are still here. We know that the numbers of women formally involved in peace processes are still very low. But at the same time, we also know, as Sanam was underlining at the beginning, that there is a high number of women working on the contrary besides those formal tables, often without a recognition, without a support, remaining invisible. And here I think that the networks, and I will come to that, but I really think that the networks can make a difference. So we are still struggling to fully implement the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And I think that first of all, it's an issue of accountability. Somebody before me was mentioning it. So the accountability and making the commitments really become reality. So definitely we need to do more. We need to push us. We need to push us to do more and to strengthen our collective action. And here I would like to bring more specifically my experience related to the Women Mediators Networks and probably address three main aspects. First of all, the women's inclusion and meaningful participation, so the women's agency, and then networks, so the added value of networks, and finally synergies, because I think that this is also an important aspect of our discussion. So on women's meaningful inclusion, I think that I already started saying that if we want to take forward women's meaningful inclusion in peacemaking, this means, first of all, that we need to consider this objective more seriously. And here I have in mind the stakeholders, the government, so the political level. It's really a question of accountability. This means, first of all, that we need to provide more opportunities, to create the spaces, to giving voice to women. I agree with Sanam. Of course, training is really important, but at the same time, I look at the networks of women mediators and I see many women already trained, already experienced, ready to play a bigger role. So we just need to recognize what they are doing and really create the space. And this, of course, can benefit the stakeholders in two ways. This means, by definition, bringing diversity to the process, have a more inclusive process. But at the same time, it's an opportunity for stakeholders and for government, because they can benefit from the insights, the views, the perspective, the knowledge of the local context of those women. And I think that this is particularly relevant now when we have to face such huge challenges. And at the same time, we need to support other women fighting for their rights and for their future. So we need a critical mass of women engaged and involved in terms of numbers, and at the same time we need to recognize what the women are already doing at all levels, channeling their needs and views. And this means, second point, for me, this means really supporting what women are already doing, also in terms of funds and political support. Sometimes this means also thinking a little bit out of the box, adapting the responses and the approach that we have. So, for instance, it means investing in long-term measures. Sometimes what we are doing doesn't have tangible and concrete results in just a few months. And so we need to, let's say, to explain and to highlight this also to governments, donors, dialogue. Creating the premises for peace takes a long time. It's really a long-term investment. And then in the end, I think that everything comes back to the political will. So we need to see the Women, Peace and Security agenda as a political agenda, as a cross-cutting political agenda. It's not just about gender equality, it's really about peace and security for all of us. And this brings me to the second point, the role of networks. So as was mentioned before, over the past years, a number of regional women mediators networks have been launched in different regions across the globe. These networks are today connecting women, supporting their work, empowering them, amplifying their voice. And I think that let's say the added value of those networks is really the fact that they are powerful bridges, and they are really creating connections between the different levels, from the local to the region and the global level, but also they are trying to connect the political level, so the institutions, for instance, with the civil society and the grassroots level. They are providing, or they are trying to provide the access to stakeholder and the political level, and I think that this is what we need if we want to bring a change. They are also important resource for linking knowledge and capacity, important source of information and expertise. But then the added value is also related really to the idea of a network. So women supporting each other, sharing experience, empowering each other. So the added value is not really just in terms of numbers. It's not just about how many women in the end are seated at the peace tables, which remains, let's say, the main objectives. But it's also related to what the networks can do to empower those women in terms of capacity building, in terms of creating the bridges between the different levels. And it's also in terms of mindset. So if we want to change the mindset and the narrative about women's role, is also essential what the networks are doing, because they are showing us what women can do for peace and security, how they can really contribute to peace and security. And I think that now this collective voice that we have, such as networks of women mediators, can also be very useful to keep the attention of the international community on the security crisis and the valuable contribution of women to those crises. I think it's also really important, and this is what we are trying to do, to create synergies. If I look at the Regional Women Mediators Network, they created in 2019 a global alliance. I think that there's a lot of potentiality there, because it means that 6 networks, regional networks, are coming together to amplify their voice and also to maximize the impact of their action. And I think that, again, there is a lot of potentiality there, but what we need also to be able to advance the agenda and to move forward our work is to have more political first of all, more political support, and then, of course, to be supported also in terms of funds when it comes to really support the initiatives on the ground. And these very briefly bring me to the third point, synergies and partnership. I think it's really important, and it clearly emerged also today in our discussion, to work more in partnership and in synergies. This means, first of all, promoting synergies among the different actors, also on the ground, because in the end we all have let's say, a specific objective, a common goal, which is peace and stability. But this means also creating more synergies among the different agendas. So we are still conceiving policies and agendas in silos, while in the end we know that everything is really very much interconnected. So, for instance, if we want peace, we know that we need also initiatives to foster the social and economic development of the countries involved. So in the end, again, everything is interconnected. And we need also, in terms of partnership and synergies, men on board. So we need also men engaging actively with us to advance the women's participation, because it cannot be just a discussion among women, among ourselves. And then to conclude, let me take this opportunity just to briefly mention what we are doing as Women in International Security Italy on Afghanistan and with Afghan women. So we started last year a sort of task force, including Afghan women who held high-level positions and senior roles at the political, diplomatic, and negotiating level, mainly from the diaspora, but also from who are still in Afghanistan. And the idea here is, first of all, to listen to those women, to reinforce the message that they are bringing. So we believe that if Italy and if the international community needs to elaborate an action plan and work plan which really responds to the needs of people, we need first of all to ask those women what are their needs and their expectation. And it's about also really highlighting and recognizing their expertise and their experience. So in most of the cases they are in the diaspora, asylum seekers, refugees, but they are coming here despite the challenging conditions. They are coming here with a huge background of experience and expertise, and I think it's important to recognize it, and it's a way to empower and reinforce women. Second objective is really to reinforce this sisterhood, solidarity, experience sharing among women. So we are putting in touch and creating connections among those women and other experts, women mediators and negotiators, and is also a way to foster synergies. So here again, we understood that many initiatives are on the ground. Many initiatives were developed in the last 1 year and 1.5 years. And I think it's really important to avoid duplications and try to see how we can maximize our impact and join our efforts. And this is why also being here today in this framework, it's really important for me and goes in the right direction. So I think that we all had the chance to meet many courageous women, Afghan women, and I'm really impressed by their strength, their courage, their willingness and determination to make a difference and to bring a change for their country. And it's really a question of supporting them and address their untapped agency, which can also contribute to a different paradigm in foreign policy. So we were talking about feminist foreign policy. Of course, what we need is to also look to a different way of doing foreign relations, cooperation, humanitarian assistance, which means reflecting a gender-sensitive approach, but also a more diverse perspective and rebalance power dynamics. And I think that including more women means also giving a chance to overcome business as usual and try to face the current challenging in a new and different way. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Loredana. In the interest of time, I'll go to our last speaker before we go to Martin for reflections on today's discussion and picking up on some of the questions as well. And also Sanam. I'm not sure if Musarrat is here yet. I cannot see you, Musarrat, but it seems like, okay. Yeah, thanks, Julia. So I'll now go to Martin. Introduce you, Martin Russell. Martin completed his PhD at Clinton Institute, where his research focused on the role of the Irish diaspora in the Northern Ireland peace process, examining strategic diaspora engagement through diaspora media, diaspora philanthropy, and diaspora politics. He is the founder of Global Diaspora Insights, which provides advisory, research policy, and training on diaspora engagement through its in-house expertise and network of global experts. So Martin, the floor is yours, and it'd be good if you could have some reflections on the discussion so far, and maybe also pick up on some of the questions from the floor which are relevant to you or maybe to other speakers.
Perfect.
As well.
Thank you. Just before I begin, I have a lot of reflections, and when you give an Irish person a microphone, you might not get it back, but I do see in the chat maybe Masrat is here under a different name. I'm not sure. I just want to make sure that it's not her before I proceed, because in the chat it says I am here. So I'm not sure if we should go to her to speak first before I reflect.
Sorry, Martin.
Yeah, just quick in the chat it says I am here, Romana. So I'm not sure if that's Montserrat. So if you would
yes,
like me to wait before I reflect.
Okay, yeah. Hi, Montserrat, are you there? I think she says that it's not allowing me to unmute.
Yes, can you hear me now? I have been here for the last 1 hour now, more than 1 hour, because I was here at, I think
Hey,
my
not
time
showing
was
your
5.
name.
Hello?
Yes, Montserrat, it's not showing your name, so probably there was a mix of the link, but please go ahead. So yeah, I'll introduce Montserrat before she speaks. Montserrat is an internationally known expert on de-radicalization and preventing violent extremism. Her research focuses on localizing the WPS agenda, preventing violent extremism in de-radicalization, reintegration, and rehabilitation. Montserrat, among other things that you can tell us from your experience about the rules of the, if you could speak about the rules of the regional networks, as you're part of various regional networks, and some of these and some of the steps and support mechanisms that are missing at the moment within these networks to provide support to women's global or regional agency and movements. Montserrat, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kahraman. Assalamu alaikum. Good afternoon for those who are like, in your region, and of course, good evening. I just was listening to Nargis, and I think she spoke from the heart. What she said was actually based on the reality and her experience. Working with the Afghan women for almost 20 years now, and after the last year episode of the taking over of Afghan Talibans, we were just looking to the international community that now they are going to come up with some sort of a political solution to this situation. But unfortunately, it is still everybody is looking towards it, but it has not yet come. So my point here is that it is the Afghan people themselves. They have to actually work not only within the country, but outside with the women who are very effective, who are advocating on the behalf of the women of Afghanistan. This should be brought together. We have to actually facilitate the bringing of the women who are outside Afghanistan, advocating for the rights of the Afghan women, and the women who are inside Afghanistan, and they are looking for some sort of a masiha to help them and to support them. And I'm going to give you an example. Recently in August, we had a regional conference which was organized by Pakistan and invited the women diaspora and also the women living in Afghanistan. And what we found was some of the issues that we can really help these women to resolve. And that was that we thought that in education arena, we can help them. And we asked them to map the areas where the Afghan women can carry out their educational activities. So they came up with the data, and the women in Pakistan, some of them, they adopted the schools, and we provided them with the resource material, with whatever we could do. And then we started teaching some of the teacher online, which again, the internet facility was provided by the women living there in Afghanistan. So that is one example. The other example is that the women who have been very skillful, and they have been doing a lot of work, and even their businesses, some of them have come to Pakistan. They are now residing in Pakistan. So with their support and help, we started training the women in the different livelihood skills, and also provided them the opportunity we link them with the Chamber of Commerce in Peshawar, so whatever they produce, they can be sold and they can be exhibited in different parts of the country. So I think this is one type of support that can be extended to the Afghan women wherever they are, especially those who are now have got this refugee status and who are still looking for some sort of a job. So this is sort of the support that the women who are really serious in supporting the Afghan cause can help these women to start living on their own and start earning a decent living, and of course seek education as well. The informal grouping, like, we really in South Asia, we don't have a formal network, but as the informal formats, like we said, we usually have the dialogues with the different groups, with the women in Afghanistan, with the women in Nepal. So these sort of the formats and these sort of forums are really needed, so that to understand what is happening inside Afghanistan and how we as women groups outside Afghanistan can help them. It is not only like, a powerful tool to strengthen the relationship between the women, but also it will help the women to say what they want to say and convey to the others. So these sort of a formal, I think, dialogues and formal networks and formats are very important if we really want to support the Afghan cause. The other point is, I think I just heard, the networks. Yes, the networks are doing a lot of work, and I can give the example of ICANN, when actually the situation became very worse in Afghanistan after 15th August. It was ICANN and of course Kahramana, people like you, who extended support to the people, not only facilitating visas, but for their rehabilitation in different countries as well. So I think this is really the need of the time, that the formal networks should now become more political to influence all the processes, right from, like, writing policies, becoming a part of the policy making, but also becoming part of the actions and implementation as well. So for us, this is important, that we should not be looking towards others, how we can be helped, because the UN agency has failed everybody wherever there is a conflict. I don't see many of the UN agencies supporting and helping them. And I have, like, I'm a witness to it, not only the disaster in Afghanistan, so-called the disaster that hit Pakistan many times. So their response had always been lukewarm. The international community, we still are looking towards them, but I think they are not coming up to our expectations. So outside women, outside support is important, but the networks, the formal networks that are there, like 6 networks that Loredana just mentioned, I think they really need to become more political to influence everything that comes their way. And unless and until women do not actually project themselves and do not become a part of the serious dialogues and talks, we will not be able to show we will not be able to achieve, like, the peace that we really want in the world. So for that, definitely we need a lot of I would say alliance building, building our skills and negotiation, influencing, like, certain policy makers, and of course be there in the policy corridor so that we can engage them in the real talk. Because right now we are just, I think we are doing a lot. The women, like, networks, women individually, women peace builders, especially the women diaspora, Afghan women diaspora, they are doing a lot. And the women in Afghanistan should know that how women in outside Afghanistan are helping them and supporting them. But there is no bridge between the women who are living in Afghanistan and the women who are outside Afghanistan, except few, not many. So I would suggest that outside women definitely are very important, but engaging women inside Afghanistan is crucial. And we as networks, as international community, we really need to help them organize in a sort of a network of the women outside and inside Afghanistan. If I have more time, I would also like to say one more thing that is I want to highlight is we as networks, we as regional network, and of course the international network that we are a part of, we really need to do the mapping. What the women in Afghanistan lack, what they need, and how we as women network can do something tangible for Afghan women. I gave you the example of engaging the training of the teachers, and how they can actually conduct they can carry out with the education in their own respective areas. So I think that is one example, and there are many examples that I can give. But my only point here is that we have not yet been able to build up the pressure on the Taliban who are there. we have not been able to build any pressure on them. They are not listening to anyone. So there has to be a way to engage them. And if it comes from the women network, that will be very, very important. And I think if there is a will, like somebody mentioned earlier, there is always a way. So we really need to have that will to start engaging those who are at the helm of affairs in Afghanistan today. We really need to be engaging and influencing the mindset of those people. Believe me, people say they cannot be changed. We don't want them to change. We want them to listen to what women are saying. We want them to listen to what women needs are. We want them to listen to actually what the actual Islam says about women rights. So I think that because what they are saying is against the Islamic tenets, it's against the principles of Islam, and of course the tradition of the Holy. And I haven't even seen the Taliban's pan-Islamic vision or the Taliban's the vision for a stable Afghanistan. So I think we really need to be engaging them in some sort of a discourse regarding the way forward regarding the future of Afghanistan. And of course, in that future, women should be there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Musarat. This was very inspiring. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. I would like to say that we will go a little bit over time from our planned end time of the event. So Martin, the floor is yours now.
Perfect. Look, there's a lot of reflections to unpack here, and I think I want to begin with an offer, because I think the last two speakers have really kind of emphasized the importance of networking. And as somebody who has spent the majority of their professional life training people how to network, I would be very happy to host a free session for the colleagues on the call around how do you actually build networks, and particularly diaspora networks. Because I think there's a couple of things that cut across a lot of the conversations. And I think Sanam set the tone with a very sobering and honest reflection of where we are. And I think that echoed through some of the other interventions about, maybe we're at a point of critical reflection where a lot of great work has been done in shaping the discourse and things like that. But sometimes discourse can let leadership off the hook, if we're being honest, right? So I think what really jumped through to me in the presentations and the interventions is that we're at a key transition moment where, we have to consider how do we build agency through our power. And I think power was actually mentioned once across the presentations from Leila. And I think part of that is the network power. And I think what we also have to realize, I think for the agency of women within not just this movement, but other movements, is that sometimes we have to work hard to grab that power, and we shouldn't be apologetic about that. I give an example in the area that I'm passionate about in terms of diaspora engagement. Similar to Sanam, as she outlined, quite often diaspora engagement would be kind of a side event at a side event over the last kind of 10, 15 years. And the most important thing that we did along the way in that, I think, was to say, no, we're not going to do those. We'll wait till we have our own and we build our own platforms. And what I'm trying to say there is what seems to be jumping out to me in the presentations is that to get to the transition from shaping the discourse in that informational or educational space, when it comes to action, that step is not necessarily happening as we think it should be. And that's what we need to address. And that's what we need to figure out. And for me, the way I would sum that up is that there's a deep disconnection between hearing what somebody is saying and listening to what somebody is saying. And I think in terms of shaping the discourse and what we've done, and I probably shouldn't say this as an academic, because it's very important that we're clear about what we talk about and how we frame it. I think, when we talk about the political will and the political influence, maybe the political leadership, particularly in the West and countries that are organizations or institutions that should have it, maybe see the discourse as a bit of an out, and I say that as somebody that has worked in diaspora engagement where gender issues has been treated pretty hollowly as well, if that's a word, and one of my great heroes in diaspora engagement is a lady called Melek Pulakonak, who created the first ever, what I think is a global tribe of diaspora sisterhood for Turkey. And it's an incredibly powerful network. So what I think we need to do is to think about how do we build that power to make sure that the people are not just hearing what we're saying, but listening to what we're saying. And what does that look like in reality? And I think what we need to really understand is the evolving connotations of where diplomacy happens and how power is created in the networked age. And one of the forerunners of thinking in this, and I think it jumped across a lot that was said from the different speakers, was that in the network age, the measure of your power is your connectedness. And I think what I've heard, particularly through and that was from Professor Anne-Marie Slaughter, who heads up New America, but formerly a professor at Princeton. And what I'm hearing is that we have a lot of really innovative, creative, and courageous work going on. And the next step is, how do we network it to really build the power proposition of what we want to move, to transition from discussion and discourse and framing, and almost a light commitment from those with the political will to really invest in it. So they were the main reflections that jumped through. I'm conscious of time, and I don't want to hog the mic, and I want to get to the questions from the floor, because a lot of people have been kindly listening in over the last hour and 20. But what I would say is, you know, from the presentations, I think Leila put it quite well, and Loredana, Montserrat, and Nargis gave a really honest reflection based on what Sanam said about, you know, well, where are we now? And truly, what type of progress are we making? And most importantly, you know, not just expecting agency to be given, but how do we create the power that you know, it's a no-brainer for the people, you know. And quite sadly, for people that are in power, let's be provocative, that might mean that some of them will have to give up their seats. And hopefully the good leaders in the world will understand that, and we'll have allies to help us achieve that. So I'm happy to roll into the questions directly, Romana, if you'd like, but if you'd like to jump in and facilitate that, I'm happy to hand over to you. So look, I think there's two kind of main questions that came out in the chat. One is directly for Sanam, I believe. And I know you saw that question in the chat already, Sanam. So would you like to jump in and address that question?
Sure, Rahman, is that what you'd like us to do? Do you want me to?
Yes, please. Yeah.
So a couple of things. I think, sorry, let me read I'm just trying to get back into the chat again, just to read.
So I can give you the question at the top, Sanam. So you mentioned that women activists should resist participating in peace processes where they are putting all women for a sidelined or sideshowed. How, where, and who should be pressured to get women into track one negotiations?
So thank you. So I think it's a couple of things. I think one is, it's really important to be on the same message across all of our networks. I mean, one of the things that I think we have created in the last 22 years is we have a really, really strong ecosystem of women's peace building organizations and voices together. You know, at WASP, we have over 90 organizations in 40 countries that are now reaching out through the She Builds Peace campaign. Lila was talking about the WILF network and how it's expanding. So, and then all the mediation networks that are sort of more about individual members, and many of us are part of these things. But we have to be part of what we have to do is we have to be consistent. It can't just be that our message is, there should be independent women's delegations going, and then others saying, oh, well, we want women in the existing delegation. We have to say the same thing repeatedly. And there's a difference. One of the issues that we have to also grapple with is that those, if you think about the Afghan women or the Yemeni or the Syrians and others that are on the ground being active, they are not just mediators, because mediator has an impartiality about it. I've been on a mediation team. I go into a country and I'm coming in as a third party that is meant to be impartial and so forth, and trying to help facilitate things. A peace builder is on the ground. They have a political position, right? They may not like what the government does, and they may not like what militias or armed groups are doing, but they're not impartial. They have particular views, and they're representing a particular community. So in our own discourse, we have to be very, very clear about who we say should be present and in what form. And the reason why I say it's really important not to get sidelined is that it's really, on the one hand, flattering, right? To say, oh, yes, you've been invited to such and such meeting and come and help put together, give us your recommendations, as Nargis was talking about. But given that we know that this is what's been happening for the last 10, 15 years, and it doesn't go anywhere, actually, if all the women say, no, we're not going to do that, we're just not going to, we're not going to play the game of showing up for side events. Maybe that's, using the power and the clout, because up to now it's been big institutions using women's movements in this way, right? And claiming that they've done stuff. It's but we should be thinking about where is our strength, where is our power, and where do you draw the lines around what you accept and what you don't accept. So I think those are but the specific messaging of women's independent delegations in peace processes in the formal process. It's happened before. Northern Ireland, they had the Women's Coalition. Somalia had the Sixth Clan. It's doable, right? And at least we should be asking for that. So that's as I say, the sideshows, everybody knows that side events are literally sideshows. It's an understood fact. On the diaspora and the networking, just one thought on that. One of the issues that I've seen is that if you're in the diaspora, to me, one of the key issues is you shouldn't be ahead of what people are on the ground. You should be enabling and be the voice for folks on the ground. And if anything, for example, in the case of Afghanistan right now, one of the struggles that we have is that people have needs. There's a humanitarian crisis that's on the ground, right? If you're in the diaspora and you're not actually addressing that humanitarian aspect, you begin to lose relevance and legitimacy on the ground. And this is something I say this from the Iranian experience, right? You need to be addressing the needs that people have at the same time as being their voice. And then very importantly, it's really important that diaspora doesn't add harm, doesn't become and we see, it's very easy to get stuck in the diaspora, stuck in if you left Palestine in 1948 or 1967, or, if you left Iran in 1979, or people get stuck in their own universes. The country on the ground has moved ahead. And so if you're going to be doing diaspora activism, I think it's very important to be cognizant of the shifts and changes on the ground in the country itself, and then really thinking through what is the added value that I bring? What is my role at the international level versus somebody who's on the ground? And this is something in the ICANN WAS network we talk a lot about. For me, it's not for me to say what Mussarat should be doing in Pakistan, but it is where I sit and I have connection around the world. My job is to enable and facilitate the connectivity that way. So everybody has their role. It's really an ecosystem that we have to be thinking about.
I think that's incredibly well said. And maybe a quick follow-up question to that maybe Sanam, you can jump in first, and maybe we open it up, because at least I'm seeing visually Loredana nodding her head, so she may want to come in and reflect on this as well. I completely agree on the diaspora angle, and even in the Northern Irish story, not too long ago, the diaspora were doing some pretty harmful things, in terms of what was happening in the North. And I guess, as I was reflecting on the conversations as well, sometimes we use this word networks and networking, and we get that they bring collective action and advocacy and power and time, but should we be building different types of networks as well? So for example, just give you a reflection on my own work in the peace process in the north of Ireland, we found that, quite often it was kind of what we called mile wide, inch deep networks that would, engage the masses and the community, and that would be around issues of education and awareness and advocacy and things like that. But we also needed to create what we called inch wide, mile deep networks, which were for people in the diaspora that could access those political corridors of power, that could access those really kind of, influential, whether that was from humanitarian perspective, political perspective, whether it was from economic perspective. So do you think that quite often, because quite often, as you say, in diaspora engagement, one of our most popular presentations is 25 reasons why it fails, and quite often what you see is that there's this rush to market because of energy and enthusiasm. And we heard already about the duplication of effort and things like that. So I'm just wondering, do we need to start thinking about the type of networks that we're building as well in this area to really advance the agenda and the political capital it can bring and the different types of power it can bring? And maybe to the other speakers, if they'd like to jump in that question as well before we go to the final question from the chat. Thank you.
Maybe others would like to answer since I've spoken already.
Can I just quickly, coming back on your point, Sanam, and I totally agree, what has been lacking in the case of Afghanistan, that the diaspora advisory in the past has had no accountability. And as you rightly mentioned, that people who have left country decades ago got stuck in their own bubble, and international governments have tapped on oftentimes on obsolete resource in most cases in terms of getting advice and doing things on the ground, entirely different from what they were advised to do. And I totally agree on this. And there is a movement and there is a discussion on how much accountability means for those who would like to be active in the diaspora community, and who will be people who are not in their own context but would like to be involved in their own context from exile. So accountability is something that needs to be pushed forward, and people who do not necessarily have on the ground experience, but also that firsthand linkage with the people on the ground, should not be given the opportunity to be advising, to be leading processes. So Khalilzad, for example, is one example. I mean, he was an American representative, but he is originally an Afghan, and the knowledge and the experience that he was using was not necessarily in line with what was happening on the ground. Yeah, so I just wanted to share my thoughts in this regard.
Thank you so much. I'd also like to add a point about the diversity of feminist activism, and how do we use the spaces we've got to make the sum better. We've seen how those with power sustain power by setting the rest of us against each other. And that sometimes is internalized within the many feminist movements looking at a particular situation or a particular method of activism. And driving from the example that Sanam provided about when women are only given the space to be advisors in a peace talk, when we know full well that not only they have far more to provide, but also that they know far more than whoever they are advising, and that they are being reduced into, being in the photo but not being listened to, or being listened to by very minimal actors and not shaping the process. And when women agree to be in this role for multiple reasons, they think any opening is worth it. They think that, their impact should be incremental. They could have multiple reasons. I think we have made the mistakes in the past of, instead of looking at the power that reduced them to advisors, into looking at their choices of taking the space that's available to them. And I think all of us are complicit one way or another in this. So perhaps now it's time, having seen all the hundreds of methods that women have been involved, to agree that there's always going to be a diversity of women activism, and there's always going to be different ways that things get done, and that we will oppose the notion that we need to have similar methods, and to use the relative safety that we are in, both in diaspora but also in international organizations, and in the relative safety, to provide the radical option, to question the power that's only giving very minimal roles to women, even if they chose to agree to do it, and to continue to question the hierarchy rather than the individual actions. I think the diversity of the movement is sometimes frustrating, but the collective power of it, and being mindful that we are being set against each other by power, by those who possess power, and taking a step back and opposing that is of value as in itself. Thanks.
Thank you, Leila. I see Nargis has her hand closed, and then maybe if we close with Nargis or Loredana or any other speakers want to have a quick kind of closing reflection, and then we come back to Purvamana for any closing reflections. Thank you to everyone. Nargis, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martin. Well, there is one dilemma that I'm beginning to have when we're talking about women participation in the peace process. I keep on saying that, look, we had so many colorful conferences in Afghanistan, and which was participated by, at that time, high-level government officials, by the international community, and women also had some dialogues with the Taliban in Doha. But then what happened after 15 August, everything changed. It was totally different than what we were planning, what you're discussing. So we also need to have a reflection on, is the participation the goal or the means? If it is the means, I think that we should not always rush into participating whatever initiative is taken by the governments, international community, or anybody. We really have to look at whether we can influence anything there or not. I remember a few months back, the first time Norway invited Taliban to Oslo and arranging their meeting with them, with a group of civil society and women's rights activists. And I was also invited to participate in that peace talks. And I remember it was very difficult because it took me like 4 to 5 days to decide whether I wanted to participate or not. Because I was asking constantly the question that when we had talked to the Taliban several times, when we had discussion with them and dialogue with them in 2 years of time in Doha, and they kept on promising and they did not deliver on any of them, what is the guarantee that they will deliver on any promises that they will make in Oslo? And then when they have not delivered anything, why the international community is, or Oslo is once again, Norway is providing them the platform by bringing them in Oslo. Because what I also saw in case of Afghanistan, I'm sure in other countries as well, is that sometimes because of the pressure, yes, they will have women in the peace talk or on the around the peace discussion table, but that does not mean that women would be a part of the decision making, and that also does not mean that women's voice would be heard. And end of the day, the political deal or settlement will take into account the recommendations of women. So we really have to see that how we really can make our recommendations or perspective more effective. I mean, participation is great and the more mainstream way to do that. But what we have seen that unfortunately they have politicized that. They're using our participation for their PR and for getting approval and legitimacy. But end of the day, they are doing exactly what they want to do. So how can we build an accountability mechanism or at least a system to prevent that? And I would be very interested to hear, especially from Sanam John and others as well about this.
Thank you, Nargis. And I think Sanam used the word earlier that really captures what you just spoke about in terms of, instrumentalizing. And that's what tends to happen in the sense of, the agenda and the agency being instrumentalized. And part of it is getting the power back to shape how the agenda and the movement can be mobilized. I see Sanam has her hand up, so I'll hand to Sanam, but Loredana, just raise your hand if you do want to jump in after that, because I'm getting signs that we're running over for time. I'm happy to speak all day, but I get in trouble. So Sanam, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to say, I mean, these are complicated questions that we need some more time to discuss. But what I would say is that the key question here that we need to be thinking about is power, right? What is our power? What is, and unfortunately, what I've seen over the years in the places I've worked is that women, when they mobilize and they're engaged in local activism and peace, it's always, I mean, at least on the peace work and the rights and peace building issues, it's positive power that we're bringing. But the international system only pays attention to negative power, right? So it really only listens when it's about people who want to spoil and destroy and so forth. And then they start to pander to them and invite them in and out. And this is one of the things that I think in the women's movements, we need to be thinking about. What is our power? What is the, is it naming and shaming? Is it disruption? What is it that forces the folks that, the institutions and so forth to actually pay attention, right? That's one thing. And then secondly, going back to Nargis John's point, I think that we need, and to what Lila was saying, I think one of the things is that we need to be really strategic, right? We need to be present across the board, right? So the way I see it, if there is chance to be present in the negotiations, be there. If you can have your own delegation, be there. If you can be an advisor, do it. But don't do it in isolation of the rest of the movement or the rest of the ecosystem. And certainly don't think that, oh, it's me, so now I can just ignore Laila because they didn't select her, right? It really should be those who go on the inside should be talking to people who are on the outside, people who are deliberately, Nargis and I had this conversation last year at some point. It was like, if you're going to be outside, it's really important because you need some radical voices, but those radical voices need to be connected to the ones that are trying to make things move. So there's a lot more strategy that we need to have amongst the women's movements and the voices and individuals that get selected and so forth. But there's also a question of what is the power? And I'll end with this. If you look at the Afghan girls and women who are still on the streets a year and a half later, if you look at the women in Iran who are on the streets, they are literally, this is all outside of the structures of power. And the institutions are UNs and others that are so embedded in thinking of themselves as institutions of member states, as opposed to institutions that are meant to also uphold human rights. They've become paralyzed. We're not getting anything particularly useful out of the UN vis-a-vis Iran. And the more silence we have from UNICEF or from where are the human rights voices, etc., the more silence we have, the more discredited they end up being, because it feels as if they're complicit with the state that is not killing children or the state that is arresting women and young people. So that's another part of it, that the institutions have to start thinking about how they deal with the duality of being, yes, they are institutions of member states, but yes, the Charter of the United Nations is we the peoples. It's not we the member states, it's we the peoples of these United Nations. And I think that's the part that we need to reinvigorate as a community also. Thank you.
Incredibly well said, Sanam. Thank you. So, Loredana, any final questions or reflections from the other speakers? Because I'm getting warnings.
A lot has been said, so I know that we are running out of time. But I think that again, this issue of power is really important, and we know that there are many initiatives, there are many networks. Now, the real question is how we can leverage all those initiatives in a consistent way in order to be really more effective. And this is a work that we need to do all together. And again, this is like we need a follow-up on this, and definitely we need to continue our discussion and our work together. So thank you for this opportunity and for this very interesting discussion.
Perfect. On that point, I'll hand back to our facilitator, Kudrama. So thank you for your time and leadership in this, and it's floor is yours to close.
Thank you so much, Martin, and thank you, everyone. This is a very interesting discussion and can go all day, but I would like to bring this to a close and thank all of our speakers again for sharing their valuable experiences and for your dedication to the cause. We'll be in touch on next steps and next rounds of discussions to unpack the topic further and draw on more specific policy recommendations. For today, that is all, and a special thank to our participants and audience and those who have asked questions, and of course our wonderful colleagues who are leading this from behind the scenes and providing technical support. I wish you all a wonderful time ahead. Until next time, take care. Bye.